When Final Fantasy VII launched back in 1997, the world of video games was, quite simply, blown away by the adventure that Cloud Strife and his comrades undertook as they set out to defeat the evil Sephiroth and save Gaia. But the game was so much more than just the story of these select few characters, as Final Fantasy VII featured a rich and diverse extended cast of characters that would help to make the world feel much more lived in, providing it with plenty of depth and substance. Some of these characters like Shira, Bugenhagen and Heidegger played an active part in the story, helping or hindering progression through the imparting of knowledge or through the implementation of their egotistical schemes. The role of the wider cast though was multifaceted, and this was perhaps best demonstrated by Zack Fair, who despite not having that much screen time was revealed as being a core component in the development of Cloud Strife. The scenario writers had always planned for Cloud to have a false identity, but it was Kazushige Najima who, right at the end of the game's development, decided that the false personality should be based on an actual person. It was a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, not least in the context of Final Fantasy VII itself. It would mean that the scenario would include a much more fleshed out look at the events that transpired in and around the Nibelheim Mako reactor. But it also meant we'd get to see much more than that, as for some reason both Najima and Tetsuya Nomura were drawn to Zack as a character. Given his late addition to the story, he was only ever intended to play a small role, but there was just something about him that got their creative juices flowing, and the pair felt compelled to just develop Zack further. It saw them start work on supplemental material that was essentially just done for fun, but once it was decided upon that Zack Fair would be the protagonist for Crisis Core, this supplemental work would then be used as a basic framework for a whole new narrative about the events that led up to Final Fantasy VII. What's perhaps most interesting about this is that their enthusiasm for the character permeated into the wider masses. Despite starting off as such a minor character, Zack has become incredibly popular amongst the fans, and in Japan he was actually voted as the most popular character, ranked ahead of even Cloud, which is just insane when you think about it. We've also seen that popularity reflected in requests for Origins videos, and it's at this point that we'd like to apologise, because despite Zack being the most requested character for a good 6 months now, we just wanted to explore other games and characters before coming back to the lore of Final Fantasy VII. Before we dive into Zack's origins though, I just want to remind everyone that even if you are already subscribed to Final Fantasy Union, make sure you hit that notification button to get notified when we publish new content. And also be sure to let us know in the comments who you'd like us to see cover in a future Origins video. Alright, so let's get started with Zack Fair's origins. Zack Fair was born at some point during 1984 of the Mu era in the small village of Gongaga, and he had a humble upbringing, as Gongaga, like many of the other villages which had been selected for the location of Mako reactors, was relatively remote. There was, however, plenty to aspire to, and other inhabitants, like the Turk called Balto, had shown that despite the obscurity of living in Gongaga, prowess with the martial arts could still be acquired. Perhaps having been inspired by this, Zack had gained dreams of leaving Gongaga from a young age. He didn't want to just be a country bumpkin, and he wanted to make something of his life. And so, when he was aged only 13 years old, Zack left Gongaga for Midgar, determined to join Soldier and rise to the rank of Soldier First Class. In the years that followed, Zack excelled within the Shinra military, and after joining Soldier, he managed to progress to the rank of Soldier Second Class. Part of this was due to his natural prowess, but he also learnt a lot from his teacher, Angeal Hewley, who was a Soldier First Class. And having monitored him for some time, Angeal made the recommendation to Lazar de Sericus, the director of Soldier, that Zack should be considered for promotion to Soldier First Class, a rare honour. Upon hearing the news, Zack was ecstatic. He of course was extremely excited about the prospect of becoming a Soldier First Class, but in the wider context, it would put him much closer to achieving his main dream of becoming a hero to the people, much like Sephiroth. The good news was that after months and months of frustrating drills and exercises, Zack would have an almost immediate opportunity to showcase his talents in the field, as due to the recent desertion of Genesis Rhapsodus, he would be deployed to Wutai in order to investigate. The bad news was that this mission would also have a rather unexpected conclusion, as Angeal would also be accused of deserting, by Sephiroth no less. This notion was incredibly offensive to Zack. Angeal had only ever spoken to him of duty and honour, and these were values that Zack also placed much value in. But with little to no intelligence regarding what had actually happened to Angeal, Zack was forced to try and put this whole ordeal out of his mind and concentrate on his job at Soldier. But with Angeal and Genesis both gone, and with Sephiroth refusing to undertake any mission involving the pair of them due to their long history together, Lazard was forced to turn to Zack to help further the investigation of the disappearance of Genesis, or that's how it seemed at least. In reality, Sephiroth had chosen Zack for these missions, as he was impressed by his devotion to Angeal, and he felt as though Zack would be able to get through to Angeal and bring him back without conflict. Zack's next mission, which took place a few months after Angeal's disappearance, would see him venture to Benora alongside Sung of the Turks. It was the hometown of Angeal and Genesis, and they had hoped to find answers about their disappearances. But Zack was mentally ill-prepared for the warped world of riddles and death that had been constructed by Genesis. Having searched the town, Zack only found one resident still alive following a purge by Genesis, Gillian Hewley, Angeal's mother. The two shared stories about Angeal's famed Buster Sword and the honour that it represented, but soon after their talk, Zack would find Gillian dead, with Angeal standing over her body, sword drawn. Zack was horrified and instinctively lashed out at his former friend and mentor, thinking that he had been the one to do the deed, but the truth was much deeper than Zack knew. Gillian had been part of Shinra's Genova experimentation and was a brilliant scientist. Alongside Dr. Hollander, she had worked on Project G, or Project Gillian, which saw the birth of both Angeal Hewley and Genesis Rhapsodus, two children with enhanced capabilities. But Genesis was imperfect and was degrading. He had hoped to use Gillian's mind to find a cure, but she instead chose to take her own life instead of helping him. It meant that Zack was getting wrapped up in something much larger than he could ever have imagined, and after a brief parley with Genesis, he was left to ponder upon everything he'd seen and heard. He just couldn't understand why Angeal would have left and sided with Genesis, and it weighed heavy on his mind in the months that followed, leaving him conflicted. Angeal had been such a strong figure for him in the past few years, and Zack still couldn't bring himself to lose faith in his mentor. But with everything going on, when Zack was promoted to Soldier First Class not too long after, that excitement and enthusiasm from before was just no longer there. He knew that this promotion wasn't based on merit per se, rather that it was based on necessity, following Shinra's declaration that Genesis and Angeal had been killed in action. It meant that the dream he'd held since he was a child, that led him to leave his home at such a young age, had been sullied. But there was little time to dwell on this as Shinra decided to make their move. They planned to hunt down and kill Genesis and all of his allies, including Angeal. But due to his emotional state and investment, they felt that Zack could no longer be trusted with these missions. Preempting this attack though, Genesis launched a strike against Midgar, and Zack worked with his idol Sephiroth to defend the city and strike back. It should have been a dream scenario. Only a few months prior, Zack would have been enamored by fighting alongside Sephiroth, but there was little time for adulation. The threat against the city was serious, and it was all hands on deck. Shinra even deployed the Turks to assist Soldier, and Zack ended up saving one member in particular, called Cissnei. As the conflict evolved, Zack learned that Angeal had actually been spotted within Macro Reactor 5, and after uncovering Dr. Hollander's secret lab, Zack encountered his old mentor once again. But he still struggled to understand his motivations. He had read through Hollander's research materials and he had seen with his own eyes that Angeal was now different, but he just couldn't understand why Angeal was tempted to play the role of the villain just because of these changes. That wasn't who he was, and when he turned aggressive, Zack wasn't buying it and refused to indulge. For his troubles, Zack was sent tumbling into the Midgar slums, the Sector 5 church to be precise, where he met a young woman called Aerith. Ever the ladies' man, Zack tried his best to work his charms on Aerith, and as the day continued, his positivity actually shone through. He even managed to get Aerith to see past her negative feelings towards members of Soldier, and even ended up buying her a gift to commemorate their one-day anniversary as friends. But before they could get to know each other that well, Zack was summoned back to action by Lazard, as Genesis had launched another attack on the Shinra building. On the way to provide assistance, he was confronted by Angeal, but having now had a bit more time to reflect, Zack realised that the Angeal he knew was still there. That's not to say that Zack wasn't confused by what Angeal was doing, as he couldn't fully comprehend everything that was going on, but when it came down to it, he knew that unlike Genesis, Angeal wasn't inherently a bad person, and so when Angeal asked, Zack resolved to provide help in whatever way he could. This initially led to him fighting alongside Angeal as they defended Professor Hojo, but Angeal then provided a tip about the whereabouts of Genesis and Hollander, which saw them head for Modeoheim, a small mountain village. As this was something of a covert mission, Zack was again sent alongside Sung, but for this mission, they were also able to bring along a handful of Shinra infantrymen. Things got off to a rather abrupt start though, as the helicopter they were in was shot down and they were forced to make up the ground on foot. Naturally, this wasn't part of the plan, but it did give Zack the chance to get to know his colleagues, and one of them was a young rookie called Cloud Strife, who wasn't too dissimilar from Zack a few years earlier. It meant the two bonded over their similar upbringings, and Zack even attempted to encourage Cloud to follow his dreams. Inside the Mako excavation site hidden deep within Modeoheim, Zack stumbled upon an argument that was happening between Genesis and Hollander, which he was rather quick to interrupt, but unlike the times before when he had encountered Genesis and had been distracted by summons, this time Zack finally got to test himself against one of the legendary Soldier First Class, a test that he passed, albeit in shallow circumstances due to the degradation Genesis was suffering. This was all nothing but a distraction though, as while Zack had been fighting Genesis, Cloud and Sung were incapacitated while chasing after Hollander. The culprit? Angeal. Zack proceeded forward, but when he found Angeal, he came to learn the uncomfortable truth. That Angeal was bred as part of an experiment called Project Jillian, and that having learnt this, he could no longer bear the burden of his existence. Unlike Genesis, Angeal didn't wish death and destruction on the world because of this, he instead wanted to retain his honour, and so, trusting that his student would be up to the task, he forced Zack's hand, drawing him into battle so that he could go out like a warrior. It was a fitting end for one of Soldier's finest, but after the fight, Zack was visibly upset by what had transpired. He had just ended the life of his mentor, and unlike before, where there was always the chance that he would return following his desertion and things would go back to the way they were, this was now final. There was no coming back for Angeal. Zack was alone, with nobody to help guide him. Perhaps realising this, Angeal performed one last action, handing him his family heirloom, the Buster Sword, as a way of reminding him of the virtues he had lived by and that he had tried to instill within Zack. In the immediate aftermath, Zack grieved, and he grieved hard, turning to Aerith for solace while he healed mentally. But once he was ready, he was able to look to the Buster Sword as a symbol of what Angeal represented. And with a shortage of Soldier First Class within the organisation, Zack decided that he would become the beacon of hope, duty and honour that Angeal had once been for him. He would encourage the next generation to embrace their dreams. Soon after though, Zack's positive outlook on life would again be called into question, as he was sent to deal with a sect of Avalanche that had taken root at Icicle Inn. For this mission, he again went with a member of the Turks, but was also joined by two of his friends from Soldier, Esai and Sebastian, who had just been captives of Avalanche and had knowledge of the facility they were hiding in. But not too long into the mission, both Esai and Sebastian were captured again, and this time they were turned into ravens, genetically enhanced humans created by the scientist Vahito. Zack tried in vain to rescue them, but it was too late, and in retaliation, he defeated Kainu, the raven who had imprisoned them in the first place. After making it out of the base, Zack made a grave for his two friends, crossing their sword. And following the incident, the decision was made to send Zack away. It had been a tough few months, and with Genesis and Angeal seemingly dealt with and Dr. Hollander captured, it seemed like the perfect time for some rest and relaxation. Zack though, just wanted to stay in the game. Even though he had lost his mentor and some good friends, he wanted to be there for everyone else. And being stuck in Costa del Sol felt like a real kick in the teeth for everything that he had been through. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long, as Genesis had returned and was coordinating efforts to free Dr. Hollander, efforts that succeeded despite an attempted intervention by Zack. With Genesis copies now sighted across the world, Zack decided with some gentle nudging from Sephiroth that he should go and protect Aerith. He ended up actually building her the flower cart he'd promised so that she could start selling flowers, but not too long after this was complete, he was summoned away on a mission to Nibelheim, and realising that he may not return anytime soon, Zack entrusted Aerith's safety to Sung. Their mission in Nibelheim was to investigate the reactor, as monsters had been sighted in the vicinity and local soldier operatives had also disappeared. And when they entered the reactor after being guided there by young Tifa Lockhart, Zack would inadvertently set into motion a catastrophic chain of events that would have a dire consequence on multiple levels. Inside, they found Mako-infused abominations, creations of Professor Hojo, and Sephiroth explained that while average soldiers are Mako-infused, they are still human. When Zack queried what he meant by average, Sephiroth balked. Even with his knowledge of Shinra's science department, the coincidence about his mother and the calamity from the skies both being called Jenova, and everything that they'd uncovered previously about Project Jillian, Sephiroth had never before considered that he may also have been an experiment. By virtue of Zack's question, he had ignited curiosities within Sephiroth, and Genesis arrived to make sure those curiosities were turned into realizations. As Zack then headed back into the village, he was left perplexed. When he left Gongaga all those years ago with the ambitions of becoming a soldier first class, he had never dreamt that there would be so much baggage that came with it. He had always tried to be positive, especially when he was around those who looked up to him, but this latest encounter with Genesis just left Zack mentally deflated, and it led to a rare moment of weakness when talking to Cloud. But when Cloud said some familiar words, Zack was able to center himself and return to his normal demeanor, at least in the short term, as 7 days later, events would take a rather dark turn. Zack woke to find Nibelheim in flames, and as he investigated, he found that the man responsible was the man that he had previously idolized, Sephiroth. He quickly proceeded to the Mako reactor to confront Sephiroth to understand why he would do this, but the man he previously knew was no longer in front of him, a sensation he was now becoming rather familiar with. Instead, he was greeted by a rambling madman. As a consequence, the two squared off. But even though Zack was now a soldier first class and had previously beaten Genesis and Angeal in combat, he was no match for Sephiroth and was defeated with relative ease. Despite Cloud then rising to the occasion and defeating Sephiroth in his stead, neither of them were in a fit state to try and escape from the Mako reactor, and when the cleanup crew arrived from Shinra, Professor Hojo decided to use Zack and Cloud in his latest experiment. As a result, they were both exposed to extreme levels of Mako and injected with Jenova cells. But due to him being part of Soldier, there was no effect on Zack, and Hojo deemed him useless for his experiment. With Cloud also failing for other reasons, Hojo stored them both within the Shinra mansion basement for over 4 years, until one day Zack had a hallucination of Angeal and was able to regain consciousness and break free. Even though he'd been stored away for such a long period of time, aside from suffering as a result of the sedatives, Zack was in pretty good shape all things considered. Cloud though wasn't quite so lucky. His body had accepted the Jenova cells, but his mind had collapsed due to extreme exposure to Mako. It meant that even though Zack was now free from his cage, he was also handicapped as he couldn't just leave his friend behind. Still, Zack resolved to return to Midgar as he just wanted to see Aerith again. He knew that this would be a tough journey, especially with Cloud weighing him down, but it seemed doable until he realised that the Turks were also on his trail. This was a bitter pill to swallow for both sides, as prior to the Nibelheim incident, Zack had forged a close relationship with many of the members of the Turks, often undertaking missions with them and even protecting them during difficult times. And when Cissnei tracked him down, Zack begged her to walk away. He knew that he could easily defeat her in combat, but he didn't want to go down that route if possible. But Cissnei surprised him, as after seeing evidence of what Shinra had done with their experiments, she allowed them to escape, even giving them a motorbike with a sidecar. But even with a motorbike, the road to Midgar would be perilous, especially as Genesis had caught wind of their escape. Still suffering from degradation, Genesis believed the Jenova cells injected into Zack by Hojo would help to cure him of his affliction, but after seeing some rather unsatisfactory results, he retreated to think of another plan. This would see Genesis instead target Cloud, with Gongaga being their planned place of abduction. As for all of Zack's strength with combat, he was still relatively naive and innocent. So, despite being on the run from the largest military organization on the planet, their Special Ops Division, and Genesis, Zack decided that when they passed by Gongaga, it would be a great idea to visit his parents. Since he'd left as an ambitious 13-year-old boy, Zack had only written to his parents once, shortly before his disappearance, And even with everything going on, he just wanted to see them one last time, as he might not get another chance. It was an appropriate sentiment, but not one he'd really thought through, as everyone was waiting for him. Fortunately for Zack, Cissnei was one of those people. She was one step ahead and warned him of her following through with his plan, an action that saved him from Shinra, but Genesis was another story, as Zack had walked right into his trap. Zack was desperate to save Cloud following his mistake, and he received help from an unlikely source, the former director of Soldier, Lazar de Sericus, who had been turned into an Angeal copy. All this time, Lazard had been working to enact revenge on Shinra for their nefarious plans, but after injecting himself with Angeal cells, Lazard had been won over by Angeal's sense of justice and honour, and found himself only wanting to help Zack and save the world. With his help, Hollander was then defeated, leading Genesis to retreat, and in the aftermath, Zack realised where Genesis had been holed up for all these years: Benora. It led to a final confrontation between the pair, in which Genesis utilised the power of the livestream, but again, Zack was able to prevail, and Genesis was subdued. Following the fight, Zack returned to Cloud and Lazard with Genesis over his shoulder, and he also found that the Angeal copy that had previously been protecting Aerith had joined them. But soon after, Lazard and the Angeal copy passed away, revealing to Zack that Aerith had written him 89 letters, and he realised that he'd been stuck in this Shinra mansion for over 4 years. This led to renewed vigour for him to get to Midgar and see Aerith, but with the Shinra military stepping up their campaign to find Zack and Cloud, they decided to take an unorthodox route. On the way, Zack talked to Cloud about his hopes and dreams once they arrived at Midgar, but after Zack spotted an ambush, he prepared for what would ultimately be his final fight. Despite the best efforts of the Turks, the Shinra army had closed in on Zack, and after realising that he had no choice but to fight, Zack squared off against an incredible force who were driven by greed, hoping to return with Zack's body in return for commendation. As a soldier first class, Zack fought valiantly, and was spurred on by memories of his friends, but the numbers were just too great, and despite his superior skills, the grunts of the Shinra army were able to wear him down until he could fight no longer. Zack was defeated and left to rot. After the battle, with his dying breath, Zack passed on the Buster Sword to Cloud as Angeal had done to him, and he asked Cloud to live on as his living legacy. Following his passing, Zack then entered into the livestream and was able to assist Aerith as she called upon Holy to protect the world. He also continued to serve as a voice of encouragement for Cloud from beyond the grave, notably in his final battle against a resurgent Sephiroth years later. It showed that, like Angeal had done for him, he would continue to support his friend no matter what barriers existed between them. And so, that concludes the story of Zack Fair, a character who I know means so much to so many people within the community. Having started off as nothing more than a random spark in the original story of Final Fantasy VII, Zack was able to become so much more than that. And I feel it's because he served as a representation of all the good that can be found in an otherwise dark, oppressive and nefarious world. Throughout much of Crisis Core, Zack is shown as an upbeat and positive person. He just wants to see the best in people and is trying his hardest to become a hero to the people. But as he becomes more ingrained in Soldier and becomes closer to achieving his ambitions, he gets exposed to the dark underbelly of Shinra and is caught up in a horrible web of lies and deceit. As this progresses and the exposure continues, you just can't help but feel for Zack. He struggles to deal with the sinister revelations and hardships that keep coming his way, wave after wave, and it's what makes the scene between Zack and Cloud in Nibelheim so impactful to me, as it's one of the rare moments when you see Zack reach rock bottom. But even in his darkest hour, Zack was still able to find a way to be positive and upbeat, spurred on by his friends and family. And then there's his last stand. Fans of the original game knew this scene was going to happen before they even played Crisis Core, but that didn't make its appearance any less poignant. In a weird way, I feel as though this was actually one of the crowning achievements of the game, as Hajime Tabata and his team were able to build Zack up throughout the game to the point that his death meant something, and even though it wasn't surprising, you just hoped that somehow you could find a way of preventing it from happening. Why? Well, to me that seems pretty simple. It's because Zack is an awesome character. But anyway, with that small emotional analysis out of the way, that marks the end of this Origins video. If you've made it this far, make sure you give yourself that customary pat on the back in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that like button, share the video around to all the people you know who love Final Fantasy VII and Crisis Core, and why not also subscribe to our channel. Also, be sure to let us know what you thought, and feel free to let us know what Zack means to you as a character. Why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these Origins videos, and we can reward you with, amongst other things, penning your name at the end of videos like these guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Final Fantasy VII. This is Daryl, signing out. I'll see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.